You believe you know the history of the 20th century. You are certain that behind the Iron Curtain lay nothing more than parades in Red Square, 5-year plans, and queues for scarce goods. This is a convenient fiction, a polished image crafted for textbooks. The actual truth was far more strange, more ambitious, and more terrifying. For nearly 70 years, the Soviet Union was not merely a country, it was a separate engineering civilization, operating under its own laws of physics and logic. While the West created machines of elegance and efficiency, Soviet designers built mechanical gods and monsters, born in clandestine design bureaus where the only limitation was the human imagination. The rankings of the largest tanks and fastest aircraft show you only the storefront of this madness. Today, we journey not to a museum, but into the very vaults of the Soviet military-industrial complex. We will reveal not just peculiar machines, but 10 levels of engineering delirium, each a scream of its era, frozen in metal, embodying its fears, its hopes, and its grandiose failures. Forget all that you knew. This is the true accounting, proof that the most incredible technologies were born not in Silicon Valley, but in the shadow of the Kremlin. Our countdown begins with the most primal of engineering ideas, a red thread woven through the entirety of Russian military history. If something does not work, you must build the same thing, only much, much larger. At number 10, we find not one machine, but 2 moments of this philosophy, separated by decades, but united by a single idea, the pursuit of absolute, almost comical superiority through sheer scale. The first exhibit, the Tsar Tank. Born in the crucible of the First World War in 1915, it was not Soviet, but it was a fundamental flaw of all tanks, was their caterpillar tracks. His solution, which he deemed ingenious, was to mount an armored fortress on 2 gigantic, nearly 30-foot tall wheels. Imagine a 3-story building hoisted onto the wheels of a colossal bicycle. It weighed 60 tons. Cannon turrets were mounted on its flanks and crown, with an additional machine gun sponson beneath its belly. In theory, this behemoth was to stride Kigments to flight. But during its first trial in a forest near Moscow, the predictable occurred. The rear steering roller, disproportionately small, sank irretrievably into the soft earth. 2 of the most powerful captured Maybach engines lacked the force to pull the monster from the mud. The Tsar Tank remained where it fell, a monument to ambition unmoored from reality, slowly consumed by the very forest it had failed to conquer. Left to rust in a forest, it became a monument to a particular kind of gigantomania, one that failed to account for the simple Russian mud. One might think this history would serve as a lesson. It did not. 4 decades later, in the deepening chill of the Cold War, the Americans created their Atomic Annie, an artillery piece capable of firing nuclear shells. The Soviet response was not long in coming, and it was executed in the grandest tradition of the Tsar Tank. It was called the 2B1 Oka, a self-propelled mortar that was, in truth, a cannon. Its barrel stretched 20 meters, the length of an entire subway car. It hurled 420mm projectiles, each weighing 750 kilograms, to deliver a tactical nuclear charge up to 45 kilometers away. Execution, but in the very soul of the machine. The recoil from a single shot was so monstrous it would literally tear the vehicle apart. The transmission would be ripped from its mountings, the chassis would deform, the delicate guidance mechanisms would be annihilated. After every shot,
most people stop watching right here, but if you continue, you'll
the Oka required a complete factory overhaul. These two behemoths represent the most direct, most brutal form of engineering madness. The attempt to solve a complex tactical problem with a single overwhelming blow, in defiance of physics, logistics, and common sense. They are the foundation upon which all that follows would be built. But to believe that Soviet ambitions stopped at simply scaling up the caliber is to profoundly misunderstand its nature. From singular, monstrous failures, the focus shifted to something far more systemic and terrifying. Not a single vehicle, but an entire dynasty of mechanical titans born for a single purpose: to carry the end of the world on its back. This is the story of the missile carriers from the Minsk automobile plant, or MAZ. It began in the 1950s, when the Soviet army required powerful artillery tractors. The MAZ 535 appeared, an 8-wheeled beast that could haul tanks and cannons with ease. But then the missile era dawned, and for each new, larger and more lethal ballistic missile, a unique carrier was required. An arms race began, not between nations, but between the designers of rockets and the designers of the chassis that would carry them. For the TEMP missile system, the MAZ 543 was created. Its defining feature was a split cabin. Between the two compartments for the crew, a deep channel was formed, perfectly cradling the body of the rocket. This would become the signature, sinister silhouette of the Soviet missile carrier. But the missiles only grew larger. The Pioneer complex demanded the 6-axle, 12-wheeled MAZ 547, a machine weighing nearly 70 tons, designed to carry a 17-meter missile armed with 3 separate nuclear warheads. And even this was not the limit. When development began on the Tselina II intercontinental complex, whose missile was designed to weigh more than 100 tons, an absolute monster was required. And so, a new Titan was conceived. It moved only under the cover of darkness. A 6-axled Leviathan, the MAZ 7904 stretched over 32 meters in length, with a breadth of nearly 7 meters and a height of more than 3. It rode upon gigantic Japanese tires, each 3 meters in diameter, each weighing as much as a passenger car. Its sole prototype was tested at night, a deliberate precaution to keep its monstrous form from terrifying the local populace. But this was merely a prelude. The apex of this gigantomania was the MAZ 7907, a 12-axle, 24-wheeled behemoth, nearly the length of a professional hockey rink. It was propelled not by any conventional engine, but by a 1,250 horsepower gas turbine heart, ripped from a T-80 battle tank. This turbine powered a massive generator, which in turn fed electricity to 24 individual motors, one for every wheel. This was no truck. It was a land-bound destroyer. The history of these machines is not a simple story of engineering records. It is a stark illustration of Cold War madness, an invisible front where, for every new megaton of destructive power, a multi-ton wheeled Titan was forged to carry it. These vehicles were never meant to see battle. Their sole purpose was to roam the endless taiga, a constant moving shell game to hide their nuclear cargo from spy satellites. They were silent, mobile arguments in the dispute between two world systems. They were the chariots of the apocalypse, and their singular reason for being made them the most terrifying automobiles in history. Yet the conflict was not only against a rival superpower. It was a war against nature itself, against the boundless swamps, tundra, and forests of Russia. Here, another kind of machine was born, one that seemed to have sprung from a different evolutionary branch, neither tracked nor wheeled. The ZIL 2906 screw-propelled swamp crosser. Imagine a vehicle that moves not on wheels, but on two enormous screws, literally chew their way through any surface, be it a treacherous bog, deep snow, or liquid mud, pulling the machine forward. Hollow and hermetically sealed, the augers also act as pontoons, allowing the vehicle to effortlessly cross rivers and lakes. It was the absolute all-terrain vehicle, capable of navigating places where even a tank would be swallowed whole.
If you think you've seen everything, wait. What comes next will turn everything upside down.
The concept was not new. Similar machines had been attempted in the West, but only in the Soviet Union, with its vast, impassable territories, was the idea perfected. The ZIL was no experimental toy. It was a critical component of the top-secret Bluebird Space Search and Rescue Complex. The scenario was a state planner's nightmare. A Soviet cosmonaut, having returned from orbit, lands in their descent capsule somewhere in the impenetrable Siberian wilderness. An amphibious craft is dispatched, but the terrain proves too hostile. This is when the heavy artillery was deployed. A massive truck would deliver the screw-propelled craft to the very edge of the roadless expanse. From there, it would disembark and journey into the inferno to retrieve the capsule and its precious human cargo. These creations of steel and paranoia, born of a conflict both geopolitical and elemental, now stand as silent monuments. They are testaments to an era of immense fear, but also of an equally immense and audacious ingenuity. A time when humanity, in its quest for ultimate power, built machines that could threaten the world, and others that could rescue a single soul from its most desolate corners. On solid road it traveled. Its speed was torturously slow, no more than 10 to 15 kilometers per hour. But its purpose was never speed. It was passage, absolute 100% passage. The screw-propelled ZIL, model 2906, represents a fundamentally different current in Soviet engineering thought. Not bigger, not more powerful, but smarter, cunning. This was not an attempt to conquer an enemy with brute force, but an effort to deceive nature itself, using its own laws against it. A solution of brilliant simplicity, born from a problem that existed on such a scale in only one country on Earth. Not all Soviet giants were built for destruction. Some were born to create, even if their appearance suggested otherwise. Here was one of the strangest, yet most astonishingly successful machines ever to take flight. The heavy transport helicopter Mi-10, nicknamed the Flying Crane. To see it on the ground is to see a giant metallic insect. Its long, disproportionate landing gear hoists the fuselage high above the earth. It seems a flaw in engineering, a miscalculation. But within those awkward legs lay the machine's entire genius. In the late 1950s, the Soviet economy and military faced a logistical impasse. How to move colossal cargo that defied the dimensions of any existing aircraft. The Mil Design Bureau offered an elegant solution. Instead of building an even larger fuselage, they removed it almost entirely, creating an external platform, a helicopter that did not carry cargo inside, but rather wore it underneath. The towering chassis allowed the Mi-10 to literally drive over its payload, be it a bus, a geological survey cabin, or a shipping container. From the cockpit, the crew, aided by television cameras, could engage the cargo with hydraulic grips and lift off. It could raise up to 15 tons. It ferried entire sections of drilling rigs into the Siberian wilderness, installed television towers, and delivered.
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time. and only a few people know the truth behind it.
Equipment to the most inaccessible mountain ranges. Its form was so shocking, so futuristic, that it became a sensation at international air shows in Paris and London. Western experts looked on in disbelief, unable to reconcile its clumsy posture with its staggering effectiveness. This was an icon of pragmatic Soviet madness, a machine where function had utterly vanquished form. Its designers never sought beauty. They sought to solve an intractable problem, and they did so in the most direct, unorthodox way imaginable. It was never a weapon, nor a chaser of records. It was a workhorse, that U. From the world of pragmatic solutions, we turn to one of pure, unclouded ambition. This was not merely an aircraft, but a flying utopia, a symbol of the unshakable belief that for the Soviet people, nothing was impossible. This was the colossal Kalinin K-7. The dawn of the 1930s, aviation is still taking its first tentative steps. Into this era steps designer Konstantin Kalinin with a proposal that stuns the imagination even today. He resolved to build an aircraft on the principle of a flying wing. But this would be no ordinary wing. It was a gargantuan elliptical structure, over 2 meters thick, with a span of 53 meters. Inside this aerial behemoth were compartments not only for fuel, but for passengers, or a massive payload of bombs. 7 engines gave it life, 6 pulling from the leading edge, and 1 pushing from behind. Its landing gear consisted of enormous pods, so vast they could house their own machine gun emplacements. Depending on its configuration, the K-7 could be a luxurious airliner for 120 passengers or a strategic bomber capable of carrying 16 tons of munitions. It would defend itself with a blistering array of 8 cannons and 8 machine guns. It was conceived as a flying fortress, a city in the sky. When the 40-ton monster was first wheeled onto an airfield in 1933, it caused a palpable shock. Test pilots were hesitant to even approach it. Yet the first flight was a success. It seemed the dream had been realized. But during a subsequent test, a violent vibration began in the tail assembly. The structure failed. The aircraft plunged to the earth, burying 15 souls in its wreckage. The official cause was listed as aerodynamic flutter, a complex and little understood phenomenon. Rumors of sabotage whispered through the corridors of power. The project was terminated. Kalinin himself would later be executed during the Stalinist purges. The K-7 is more than a failed aircraft. It is the tragedy of an engineering genius who outpaced his own era. The technology of the time, the materials, the engines, the understanding of aerodynamics was simply not ready for such a radical vision. It was too large, too complex, too revolutionary for its age. It stands as the most vivid example of a Soviet dream that shattered against the unforgiving wall of reality. It is a scar left upon the sky, a permanent reminder that between a brilliant idea and its realization lies a chasm that sometimes cannot be crossed. In the unforgiving calculus of aerial warfare, range is life. For the fighter planes of the early 20th century,
And now comes the part no one talks about. But this is where the real mystery begins.
their reach was brutally short, their fuel a constant ticking clock. But what if the journey to the battle was not their own to make? What if they could be carried? From this audacious question, the flying aircraft carrier was born. Soviet engineers took the colossal Tupolev TB-3 heavy bomber and transformed it into a mothership. It was a vision of mechanical symbiosis, designed to carry up to 5 fighters into the sky. 2 were clamped beneath its massive wings. 2 more perched precariously above, and a 5th was suspended from the fuselage. This airborne flotilla would either take off as one, an unwieldy constellation of metal and engine, or the fighters would launch independently, rendezvousing with their carrier to dock in the thin, cold air. Once assembled, the bizarre procession would lumber toward its target. At the critical moment, the parasite fighters would detach, deliver their payload of bombs, and then face a choice: return to a friendly airfield on their own, or attempt the perilous maneuver of redocking with their host. And the most astonishing fact is, it worked. In the opening stages of the Second World War, these Zveno, or link formations, executed several successful combat missions. They struck deep into enemy territory, obliterating a strategically vital bridge over the Danube in Romania. The enemy was left stunned, utterly baffled by how these small fighters could possess such impossible range. But if a flying aircraft carrier strains credulity, another Soviet design defies it completely. By 1942, the challenge of deploying armored vehicles to the front line remained a deadly problem. Engineer Oleg Antonov proposed the most radical of solutions. He took a T-60 light tank and gave it wings. The vehicle, designated the A-40, was a true chimera. A biplane wing, box and tail assembly were bolted directly onto the tank's chassis, turning the armored vehicle itself into the fuselage of a glider. The concept was brutally simple. A bomber would tow the flying tank into the air, release it over the battlefield, and the tank would glide silently to the ground. Upon landing, the crew would jettison the wings and tail and, in mere moments, drive directly into combat. During its one and only test flight, the sheer aerodynamic drag of the contraption proved too much for the towing bomber, which struggled to gain altitude. The tank had to be released prematurely. Yet the test pilot, a tanker by trade, skillfully brought the glider tank down in a field, landed it successfully, and simply drove his war machine back to the command post. The project was ultimately abandoned, not because the idea was impossible, but because no aircraft in the Soviet arsenal was powerful enough to tow it reliably. These projects represent a pinnacle of hybrid engineering, a ferocious attempt to crossbreed the uncrossable, to forge an airplane and a warship, a tank and a glider, into a single, functional, if grotesque, body. It was an almost biological approach to technology, where a kind of unnatural selection gave birth to astonishing monsters, creatures too specialized to survive in the long term. Until this point, the machines of war destroyed their enemies with explosives and kinetic force. But the evolution of conflict was about to take a far more sinister turn. In the 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, both superpowers began the feverish development of directed energy weapons. While American efforts focused on missile defense systems in the sky, Soviet engineers created something for the mud and chaos of the battlefield. They took the chassis of a self-propelled howitzer and mounted a turret that held no cannon. This was the 1K-17 Shati, the compression. It was a laser tank. Its purpose was not to shatter armor or obliterate fortifications. It was designed to emit a blinding pulse of energy, to permanently burn out the optics, the cameras, and the targeting sensors of enemy vehicles. And to burn out the eyes of any soldier who happened to be looking through them. Here, the very nature of destruction had changed. The goal was no longer simply to break the machine, but to sever the connection between the human and his tools of war, to plunge the enemy not into darkness, but into a permanent, searing light. In place of a conventional cannon, it mounted a block of 13 laser emitters. At its heart, a collection of colossal, artificially grown ruby crystals, each weighing some 30 kilograms. A powerful gas discharge lamp would flash, flooding the crystals with light. Then, a system of mirrors and lenses would focus that raw energy into a single, coherent beam. This machine was not designed to burn through the armor of enemy tanks. Its purpose was far more insidious. A single, powerful pulse was engineered to instantly and permanently sear the optical instruments of enemy hardware. The sights of a main battle tank, the guidance heads of incoming missiles, the cameras of a reconnaissance helicopter, all would be rendered blind, turning high-precision weaponry into useless scrap metal. It was a strategy to gouge out the eyes of an entire army. But it held another, more terrifying function. If the beam met a human eye, the result was instantaneous, irreversible blindness. It was the perfect weapon against snipers, against infantry, a silent, invisible terror born in secret laboratories. So why have the battlefields of the world never witnessed combat by laser? First, the cost was astronomical. Growing 30-kilogram rubies of perfect quality was a technological feat of immense complexity and expense. Second, the system demanded enormous amounts of energy for a remarkably low rate of efficiency. But the ultimate reason was a moral one. A special protocol of the Geneva Convention outlawed the use of blinding laser weapons against human combatants. To deploy this machine would be to commit a war crime. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the project was
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
shuttered. The lone prototype vanished. Whispers persist that it was dismantled, its unique, perfect rubies and precision lenses sold off to the highest bidder. It stands as a chilling monument to a new kind of warfare, one that seeks not to take a life, but to steal a fundamental human sense. From this vision of a weaponized future, another emerged, one that looked as if it had been stolen from the set of a science fiction epic, yet was created 5 years before the first film was ever released. The VVA-14, a vertical takeoff amphibious craft. It was the masterwork of a brilliant and tragic figure, Robert Bartini. An Italian aristocrat by birth and a communist by conviction, he had fled to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. His entire life was an obsession, a relentless quest to create impossibly fast flying machines. And the VVA-14 was to be his magnum opus. The challenge presented to Bartini was deemed nearly impossible. The Soviet Navy required an aircraft that could hunt and destroy America's most lethal undersea threat, the Polaris nuclear missile submarine. This meant the machine had to master a trinity of contradictory demands. It had to take off and land on water, even in the fury of a storm. It needed an immense operational radius, and it had to be capable of flying at both extreme high altitude and skimming just above the churning waves. These were not merely weapons or vehicles, they were physical manifestations of a will to power, a desire to control the very light that allows an enemy to see, and to master the unforgiving elements of sea and sky. In the silent archives of abandoned projects, they remain as monuments to an era when the impossible was not a barrier, but a mandate. It was designed to literally skim the crests of the waves, and its creator, Robert Bartini, proposed a solution that bordered on science fiction.
If you think you've seen everything, wait. What comes next will turn everything upside down.
The VVA-14 was a catamaran with a central wing, engineered to be equipped with 2 cruise engines for horizontal flight and 12 lift engines for vertical takeoff and landing. But its true magic lay elsewhere. To fly just above the water, Bartini harnessed the ground effect, a phenomenon where an air cushion forms beneath a wing at low altitude, dramatically increasing lift. Yet Bartini pushed this principle further. He devised a system of forced airflow, where the jets from the lift engines would be funneled beneath the wing, creating an artificial, denser cushion of air. This would allow the machine to break free from the water from a near standstill. The appearance of the VVA-14 was utterly alien. Two enormous catamaran floats, a short wing, a cockpit thrust far forward. It is little wonder that many saw in its design a resemblance to Han Solo's Millennium Falcon. Testing began in 1972. The machine performed well, both as a conventional seaplane and as a ground effect vehicle. But the vertical lift engines were never delivered, and in 1974, Robert Bartini died. Without its brilliant creator, the project was orphaned, and soon it was cancelled. Today, the only surviving prototype slowly rusts in the backlots of the Menino Museum, a monument to the quintessence of Soviet engineering paranoia. It was an attempt to forge an absolute weapon, a submarine killer that combined the functions of an aeroplane, a helicopter, a ship, and a ground effect craft. A testament to the genius of one man who thought in concepts half a century ahead of his time. But where Bartini's dream was one of complex elegance, another vision was taking shape on the shores of the Caspian Sea, one of brute force and singular, terrifying purpose. This was not a prototype, it was a real warship, whose very existence forced Western naval doctrines to be rewritten. This was the Project 903 missile carrier, the ekranoplan known as the Lun. In the 1980s, American spy satellites passing over the Caspian Sea captured images of a strange, gigantic object moving across the water at immense speed. It resembled an aircraft, but it flew too low. It resembled a ship, but it moved too fast. In the halls of the CIA, it was given a name: the Caspian Sea Monster. The Lun was the apex of the Soviet program to create ground effect vehicles. But if Bartini's VVA-14 was a complex experiment, the Lun was a crude, brutal, and lethal weapon. Its dimensions were staggering: a length of 74 meters, a wingspan of 44 meters, and a weight of nearly 400 tons. 8 turbojet engines mounted on its forward wing could accelerate this behemoth to 500 kilometers per hour. It did not fly. It stalked the surface of the sea, riding a cushion of air just 4 to 5 meters high, a predator unseen by radar, racing toward its target. These were machines born from an age of confrontation, titans of ingenuity forged in the crucible of a Cold War. They were answers to questions that history has since stopped asking, leaving them as silent, rusting monuments to a future that never arrived. It was a phantom, invisible to most shipboard radar of the era, but its true menace was not its speed, nor its stealth. Mounted upon its spine were 6 launch containers housing anti-ship missiles codenamed Mosquit. The missiles themselves were a marvel of engineering. They screamed toward their target at supersonic speeds, maneuvering to evade all defense. For a ship caught in their sights, the chances of survival were practically non-existent. The Lun was the perfect aircraft carrier killer. It could lurk beyond the radio horizon, then surge toward a NATO carrier group at immense speed, unleash a salvo of 6 Mosquits, and vanish as quickly as it appeared. It was an entirely new doctrine of naval warfare, one for which the West had no answer. A single Lun was built, accepted into the Caspian flotilla in 1987. An entire fleet was planned. But the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the economic collapse that followed sealed the project's fate. For years, the lone Caspian monster rusted at a base in Dagestan until it was hauled ashore, a future museum piece. It was not a dream, nor a failure. It was a mechanical leviathan made real, a machine whose very existence erased the line between a navy and an air force. A weapon from the future, born too late, that died with the empire that conceived it. Yet there is another story, one not of a weapon, but of an idea that could have rewritten the entire history of aviation, but remains only as a handful of prototypes and blueprints in dusty archives. Project EQIP, an acronym for Ecology and Progress. In the late 1970s, the designer Lev Shchukin proposed a concept for an aircraft that looked lenticular wing, was the result of exhaustive aerodynamic calculations and wind tunnel testing. This form possessed unique properties. The entire body of the craft functioned.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
As a single massive wing, generating enormous lift. It was also incredibly efficient. Projections showed the EQIP would consume 2 to 3 times less fuel per passenger kilometer than a conventional aeroplane. But the true revolution was in its system for takeoff and landing. The EQIP required no long runways. Around its perimeter, a boundary layer control system was installed. Jet exhaust was diverted into special nozzles, blown across the upper and lower surfaces of the hull. This allowed the craft to break from the ground at exceptionally low speeds. More than that, it created a cushion of air beneath any surface. Dirt, water, snow, even swampland. It had no need for airfields. The project was developing, a future that would never arrive, an echo of progress lost in the turning of history's page. A series of unmanned models were constructed, their trials a resounding success. But these were mere precursors to a far grander vision. On the drawing boards, colossal piloted versions took shape, ranging from versatile military transports to immense airliners capable of carrying 1,200 passengers along with their automobiles. It was a revolution in waiting, a leap in transport as profound as the dawn of the jet age. Then the 1990s arrived. An empire, once thought immutable, fractured and fell. With its collapse, the funding vanished. The project's chief architect, Lev Shchukin, desperately sought investors in the West, but his search proved fruitless. The design that promised the world inexpensive, safe, and universally accessible air travel was unceremoniously buried. This was never just a peculiar machine. It is a ghost, a phantom of an unrealized future. It stands as a silent monument to the path aviation might have taken had the currents of history flowed in another direction. While other ambitious designs of the era were evolutionary dead ends or hyper-specialized curiosities, the EQIP was a universally applicable breakthrough concept. Its descent into obscurity marks one of the great unspoken tragedies of Soviet engineering thought. It serves as a stark and haunting reminder that the most audacious ideas are often fragile and can perish alongside the very empires that dared to conceive them.